Izzy Lenger. I joined the Labour Party in 2015. The anti-Semitic abuse I received was what I was subjected to every single day. Telling me Hitler was right, telling me Hitler did not go far enough.
In 2015, Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party.
Jeremy Corbyn elected as leader of the Labour Party.
At the time, complaints about anti-Semitism were almost non-existent. If there were complaints, they went to the disputes team.
Complaints relating to anything were fairly low. At the time, we probably had 3, 4, 5 members in that unit.
Once Mr Corbyn became leader, party membership surged.
So there's an increase in members from a particular perspective, and they brought with them a particular worldview, which unfortunately allowed breathing space for anti-Semitism to arise.
Mr Corbyn has championed the Palestinian cause for decades, yet the campaign for Palestinian rights blinded some anti-racists to another kind of racism against Jews.
It was huge. The problem was massive, and it absolutely wasn't constructed by embittered old Blairites, as we were frequently described as. It was real. The environment was extremely hostile. We had what was akin to a civil war in the party, and our role was to try and bring some civility back into the proceedings.
By 2016, in Liverpool's Riverside constituency, party meetings were descending into chaos. The disputes team is independent from the party and is designed to deal with complaints. They went to investigate and found the word Zionism being used as a form of abuse. Much of the abuse was aimed at Riverside's Jewish MP.
Well, I came wanting to talk about health service, transport, public services, jobs and employment, and they wanted to talk mainly about the Middle East and particularly about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It became extremely unpleasant. People would leave the meeting in tears.
Ben Westerman was dispatched to investigate. He was the only Jewish member of the disputes team. In one interview, he was confronted with the very anti-Semitism he'd been investigating.
The person got up to leave the room and then turned back to me and said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "What do you mean, where am I from?" And she said, "I asked you, where are you from?" And I said, "I'm not prepared to discuss this." And they said, "Are you from Israel?" What can you say to that? You are assumed to be in cahoots with the Israeli government. It's this obsession with that just spills over all the time into anti-Semitism.
Ben Westerman's report didn't result in any individuals being punished, but the Labour Party changed the rules about how constituency meetings were run. By 2018, the disputes team was welcoming a new boss. A close ally of Mr Corbyn, Jenny Formby, had now been appointed General Secretary.
We had a really good team. We worked really closely together. We were all we all became friends through doing that job. But there was an increasing darkness. It became very apparent over the course of a few months that the leader's office and Jenny Formby and her team wanted us out.
She said that, quote, tackling anti-Semitism in the party is a central priority.
It's a joke. On a number of cases which I worked on, the people that she brought in when she became General Secretary overruled us and downgraded what should have been a suspension to just an investigation, or worse, to just a reminder of conduct, effectively a slap on the wrist.
In May last year, Mr Corbyn's closest advisers discussed how they might exercise some control over the National Constitutional Committee. It's the party's disciplinary body and is designed to be independent, so it should have the final say on expulsions. Waiting to come before the panel was Jackie Walker. She was a long-standing ally of Mr Corbyn. Panorama has seen an email chain including some of Mr Corbyn's closest advisers. It reveals what appears to have been an attempt to interfere with the selection of the panel who would hear her case. Miss Formby's email suggests she knew what was being contemplated was dubious. Jeremy Corbyn was copied in on the email chain.
The emails that you've shown me are really important. The issues that are raised within them should ring alarm bells across the party. To try to interfere politically within the NCC is just wrong.
Last August, Mr Corbyn acknowledged that his party could have handled its anti-Semitism crisis better.
We have been too slow in processing disciplinary cases. People who use anti-Semitic poison need to understand you do not do it in my name or the name of my party. You are not our supporters.
One by one, party officials tasked with investigating anti-Semitism left their jobs.
I was stuck between an angry and obstructive leader's office and an arcane disciplinary system. And I couldn't stop the problem. I couldn't hold the tide. And I felt so powerless and I felt guilty and I felt like I'd failed. And yeah, I had a breakdown.
In return for not having to work her notice period, Louise Withers-Green, like some others in the disputes team, was told she'd have to sign a non-disclosure agreement.
It was really tight. When I first read it, I wondered how on earth I'd be able to apply for jobs because it was so prescriptive in not speaking about anything that I had heard of or happening in the Labour Party. But I won't be able to live with myself unless I speak up about the horrendous things that I know have been happening.
I sat at my desk thinking, I can't do this anymore. I'm being asked to do things I'm fundamentally not comfortable with. The General Secretary doesn't listen to me. And the thought crosses my mind as to whether I send her my resignation and then do something that nobody should ever consider. And that I actively considered committing suicide. Walking off her roof. She has a balcony outside her office. As some way to not feel trapped anymore.
All of our questions have been directed to the leader of the Labour Party and key advisers in his office, none of whom have agreed to be questioned. And you have been sent. Why are they not sitting where you're sitting?
Well, I think it's important that somebody from the Labour Party is here to make it very clear on behalf of the entire Shadow Cabinet. We will do all we can to make it very clear to anybody who thinks that they can have those abhorrent views in our party and in our family that they are not welcome.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Edgware United Synagogue. During the 1984 United States presidential debates, when Ronald Reagan was asked about his age and suitability for the post, he quipped, "I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." Since then, Donald Trump became the oldest US president on taking office at the age of 70 and is now 73, and 4 Democratic Party candidates will break his record if elected. On Inauguration Day, Elizabeth Warren would be 71, Joe Biden 78, Michael Bloomberg also 78, and Bernie Sanders 79. By comparison, Jeremy Corbyn, about whom much will be said tonight, is a youthful 70. The perspective among you may have noticed that I attended university in a different century from tonight's panellists, who will be giving their views on what has happened since they appeared in the Panorama programme last July on the topic, "Is Labour Anti-Semitic?" So I want to set the scene of the political climate the Jewish community lived in the 1960s to show you how different things were then. There were 40 Jewish MPs in the House of Commons. 38 were Labour, and only 2, Sir Keith Joseph and Henry David Goldschmidt were Conservatives. Jews were in the forefront of radical movements, both here and abroad, supporting civil rights in America and anti-apartheid groups in South Africa. Britain had emerged from what today would be considered the consensual politics of the 1950s, the age of so-called Butskellism, a combination of the names of two successive chancellors, Labour's Hugh Gaitskell and the Conservatives' Rab Butler, both of whom favoured a strong welfare state, a mixed economy and full employment to be ensued through Keynesian demand management. In 1963, the then opposition leader of the Labour Party, Harold Wilson, enthused the country with his white heat of technological change speech, and in 1964, his party won the general election. He became Prime Minister. I remember the reaction of the students. To the strains of John Brown's Body, they sang, we'll send Prince Charles to a comprehensive school when the Red Revolution comes. And similarly, free beer for all the workers, which today, I suppose, translates into free broadband for all the workers and everyone else. We had a thriving Jewish society and a successful Israel society at LSE. We had no need for security guards, no fear of our meetings being disrupted, no threats to boycott speakers. Today, the consensus no longer exists. From the change to monetarism in the Thatcher years and the radical socialism in the Corbyn years, politics now seems more confrontational. Tonight, our panellists will inform us from their personal experiences how this more confrontational politics has impacted on them, and will place it in the context of the effect it has had in attitudes and approaches to the UK Jewish community. They may also wish to suggest what can be done to reassure the Jewish community in the future that there will be a reduction of perceived anti-Semitism. Tonight's panellists are Phil Rosenberg, Director of Public Affairs from the Board of Deputies, at the far end Joshua Garfield, former Jeremy Corbyn supporter and member of Momentum, and Izzy Langer, former Jewish student leader. Ella Rose, the former director of the Jewish Labour Movement and former president of UJS, sends her apologies. Sadly, there was a bereavement in the family at the end of last week, and she is at a shiver. I shall call on each of the three speakers to introduce themselves, and they will speak for about 10 minutes. After that, after they have spoken, there will be a Q&A session. So could I call first of all on Phil Rosenberg?
Absolutely. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you so much for having me here. It's always a great pleasure to be at Edgware United. I used to come here relatively frequently because my grandparents were members, and I was just with my Auntie Jenny Perlmutter, who some of you may know, who sends regards. So I, as Spencer's mentioned, I come at this from two different vantages. On the one hand, I'm Director of Public Affairs at the Board of Deputies, as Spencer said, and that means obviously I've taken a role in the kind of national campaign around this issue. But also, I have been a member of the Labour Party since 2011, and between 2014 and 2018, I was a Labour Party councillor in the London Borough of Camden, in West Hampstead, representing JW3 and Dennington Park Road Synagogue, if you know the area a bit. And I wanted to reflect actually a bit on the latter experience, and then if there's time, I might say a bit about the national picture, but obviously you can say in Q&A. The first thing that's really important for me to say is I didn't join the Labour Party to talk about Jewish issues or anti-Semitism. I'm very proudly Jewish. I work at the Board of Deputies. I speak about Jewish issues a lot for my day job. And actually, when I joined the Labour Party, it was a lot about talking about other things than Jewish issues. I wanted to talk about other things I cared about, whether that's school places, housing, local libraries, other issues that I care about, and I'm sure many of you care about as well. And for many of the years that I was in the Labour Party, that was very possible. Being Jewish was, if anything, a positive attribute, but if not, it was neutral. Obviously, occasionally there'd be a bit of a difficult argument around Israel and the Palestinians, but those arguments weren't anti-Semitic. They were about policy differences. That changed after Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, in my experience. Personally, and I personally experienced anti-Semitism, it started a few months after, in January of 2016, just about 4 or 5 months after Jeremy Corbyn had been elected leader of the Labour Party, at a local party meeting, a gentleman, we were debating housing, local housing policy, and one of the people there, who'd always been a bit objectionable, but never anti-Semitic or anything like that, just asked a series of very complicated questions about percentages of housing and how much it costs per square metre and so on and so on. Very complicated technical questions. And I said, honestly, I would get back to him. No one knows this information in their head. I'd get back to him. At the end of the meeting, he confronted me and he said, I'm going to shame you in the local paper. I said, why? You've asked a question. I'm going to get you the answer. Anyway, what transpired is, and it was Holocaust Memorial Day, the day the paper came out, he compared me to Joseph Goebbels in the local newspaper, the Camden New Journal. And I was just absolutely shocked. I mean, he said that, I was like the Nazi minister of propaganda, because I couldn't tell him on the spot this very complicated stuff about housing. And I wrote to him, I said, this is absolutely disgraceful. You can't go around comparing people to Nazis, and certainly not Jewish people, and certainly not on Holocaust Memorial Day. You must retract this. He refused to. He said, my dad's best friend was Jewish. Some people say their own best friend was Jewish. He didn't have a best friend who was Jewish. He called on his dad's best friend. And so began this kind of very strange process where over the next few months, he would constantly copy me into emails that made anti-Semitic comment. He spoke about Jewish millionaires doing this and Mossad being behind all the problems in the Labour Party and supporters of Israel being polluting the Labour Party. In the end, and he copied me into emails with Ken Livingstone and forwarded me things from members of the Labour Party who'd been expelled. And I, in the end, submitted a dossier of 100 pages of written evidence to the Labour Party about this terrible person. And the Labour Party completely failed to do anything about it. I mean, they ultimately, after about four months, they managed to suspended him. They didn't tell me that they'd suspended him. They didn't tell the local party. So if he'd turned up, no one would have known. And then 6 months later, they let him back in with a formal warning. But that was nothing, given all the things he had done, the fact he showed no remorse. He showed no remorse after that. I complained again. He went to the paper and said he'd been, vindicated, which he hadn't been, but, And suddenly there was this terrible thing where there was this kind of permission to indulge in these behaviours, because previously, if people had done this sort of thing, they'd have just been kicked out or they'd have been disciplined very harshly. It seemed that there was a situation where there was this culture of permissiveness. And that what started with that one person, obviously it wasn't, people knew this was going on. Other people began to behave this way. So after we'd seen as a Jewish community these horrible things with Ken Livingstone and so on, the local members of the party, a number of whom were Jewish, wanted to discuss anti-Semitism and put forward a resolution to Labour Party conference from the local branch of the party to say, we need to take action on this. The local far-left activists prevented us even discussing anti-Semitism. And then over the coming year, out of 9 meetings, 7 related to Israel or Jewish issues, and all of them had a slight anti-Semitic twist. Some of them didn't even mention Israel at all. One of them just condemned the local member of parliament, a Labour member of parliament, for speaking up against anti-Semitism. This was the kind of horrific nature of the situation. And in 2018, I said that I'd had enough of this and I wouldn't attend any more of those local meetings because basically I felt the party, or the local party at least, had become institutionally anti-Semitic. If that is the culture, that every meeting Jews have to go through this horrible gauntlet of derision to kind of just be present, then that that is the culture of anti-Semitism. That is a problem locally. Of course, as we all know, this wasn't just a local problem. This was a national problem, and we can talk about that at length. I'm sure we will. But one thing I'd say about it, and the way I try and describe it in very brief about why the Jewish community was so concerned about this, is this wasn't a difficult issue to deal with. It actually was really simple. You just take firm action on a couple of people, take firm action on Ken Livingstone, make it absolutely clear this is unacceptable, and you show from the top that this is not allowed. Repeatedly, on every possible occasion, whether it was after the Enough is Enough demonstration, when my colleagues from the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council, they went to see Jeremy Corbyn, gave a reasonable list of things that he could do, didn't do any of them. When it came to the international definition of anti-Semitism, they fought the Jewish community over a whole summer over what they would do. In the end, they were fighting over one subclause of one bullet point of the definition. They just couldn't bring themselves to do these things because they were hardwired against doing the right thing. And I think that's what made the Jewish community concerned. Because even if you were anti-Semitic, You could have pretended you weren't, right? You could have dressed it up. You could have done the things, at least publicly, that would have shown you weren't. They couldn't even bring themselves to do that. And that is why I think we were, as a community, deeply concerned. Have I got any? I'd say just one other thing. So where are we now? Obviously, we had the Panorama programme. Labour's now being investigated by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, only the second party after the British National Party to face an investigation from the EHRC. But obviously, since then, we've had a thumping defeat in the general election, the worst result for Labour since 1935. And with that comes a possible opportunity. The Board of Deputies put out in January something called the 10 Pledges, a kind of baseline of different things that any of the Labour candidates could do to take on anti-Semitism. Not everything, it was just a starting point. The good news is that all of the leadership candidates have signed up to that pledge, and a number of them have now come out with other things and other ideas around what they can do. I think that there is a determination among at least the leadership candidates, because not all the deputy leadership candidates have signed up to it, which is of concern. But all the leadership candidates realise they need to move on from this issue and deal with it. Now, they might might have different views about how well they'll each individually deal with it, and there will certainly be, for a while, this problem of people in the party, currently in quite senior positions, who are really, really on the rotten side of this issue. But hopefully we can get to a point where we begin to see that change. We'll have to hold them to it, we'll have to watch, but maybe, just maybe, we're at the beginning of a possible change for better. Frankly, it couldn't be much worse, so that's where we are. I'll leave it there and come back to Kieran.
Izzy.
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Izzy, and thank you to Spencer and the community for hosting us today, and thank you for welcoming me back as well. It was fantastic to speak a few years ago about my experiences in the student movement, which I guess mostly I'll touch on today. My route into the Labour Party was slightly different. My route into politics was slightly different. I got involved in my local students' union when I was on campus. I was on campus in the University of Birmingham. And when I was there, I didn't want to get into politics to represent particularly or only just to represent Jewish students. It was because I had issues with my course and there wasn't enough like heating in my housing and stuff like that, like really menial student issues that didn't really, I thought, amounted to much, but I thought I would try and use my voice to represent students. And when I started to enter into that world and delve into it a bit more, I realised that there was some kind of other issues that we were facing on campus. Jewish students were massively underrepresented at my university in the kind of structures that existed, despite being kind of one of the biggest Jewish societies on campus in the UK, biggest Jewish campus in the UK. And it was kind of through these type of things that I started to speak up a bit more, try and, again, use that platform that I had just to talk about my housing and my education and stuff like that, to actually try and use that for the betterment of Jewish students. I was quite vocal on my campus. I ran in quite a few elections and gained kind of some high-profile positions on my campus. And what that led was to kind of a big backlash of kind of anti-Semitic vitriol that I was kind of subjected to and fought against every day. And the surprising thing for me was that when I was on my campus, and also when I was then kind of involved in the National Union of Students, one thing very much led to another, and got involved in the National Union of Students. And what was surprising for me is that I was experiencing quite a lot of hate, quite a lot of abuse, mostly online, but still some offline threats, both kind of to myself, but to the community. Not only was that coming from the far right, as we'd expect it to, kind of groups like National Action, who are now prescribed as a terrorist organisation, the kind of the first far right group to be so. Not only was I getting kind of hate from them, the people that you'd expect and whatnot, but what was seemingly happening was that I was getting kind of similar levels, similar types, and similar rhetoric of threat from people on the so-called left of politics, and the left of student politics. And that was really what started to baffle me so much, is that not only was kind of anti-Semitism something that seemingly united the far right and the far left in kind of something that just blew me away. But kind of the language and the conspiracy theories and the kind of the way it was manifested was often worryingly similar. And kind of throughout my journey in NUS and throughout my journey on campus, that was kind of what really came to a head. And I think that alongside that, I was getting involved in the Labour Party. I joined in 2015, which normally in Labour Party crowds gets me a big cheer, because that was the year Jeremy Corbyn got elected. But definitely it was for different reasons, so to speak. But when I got involved in the Labour Party, seemingly, I got involved in the Labour Party because historically I thought it was, the party of anti-racism, the party of social justice, the party that stood up for victims, for, the proud history that the Labour Party has in representing the underrepresented and standing up for those who need them most. And that was why I joined the party, but kind of probably somewhat naively, as then in 2015, when the election of Jeremy Corbyn did happen, and what I was experiencing in NUS and in student politics very much then became replicated in my local party meetings, in not only people, who were giving me hate on social media, which was particularly bad, but not only were they either from student politics or following student politics, they also then had vote Jeremy Corbyn in their Twitter names and stuff like that. Like, they also kind of very much aligned themselves to the Labour Party. And it seemed like kind of one big world that I kind of entered into and couldn't escape from, but was seemingly quite hostile and unpleasant towards Jewish people, just for the fact that they were daring to use their voice, not only to talk about anti-Semitism, but to talk about any issues that does affect them. And the problem wasn't what I was saying, the problem wasn't my views on education policy or on housing policy or what I thought should happen to my cause. What was quite apparent to me was that the problem was that I was in the room. The problem was that Jewish people were in the room. The fact that they dared to have a voice. And there was a number of different resolutions and motions put forward nationally and locally to try and silence Jewish students, to try and get them out of the room, to try and not let them have guaranteed representation nationally and locally. And it was quite exhausting. But after kind of experiencing quite a lot of hatred and abuse from kind of Labour Party members in person, but online, that's why I decided to speak up in Panorama. I think that's something that I really took from the student movement, is that however easy and however, it seemed like it would be the easy way out to not speak up and live kind of a bit more of a normal student life, I felt obliged to kind of use that platform and to speak out and to let people know kind of what student life could be like for Jewish students on campus when they were speaking out. Definitely not saying that is the experience of every Jewish student on campus, and I definitely had a fantastic time at the same time. But kind of where things can lead can get quite dangerous and quite unpleasant for those involved. And I think that it's particularly exacerbated being a woman online as well, and that was again why I decided to speak out on Panorama. I wanted to ensure that aspect of it was covered. But I think that the Labour Party is in a very difficult place. I completely agree with what Phil said, that we're at a very pivotal point in the future of the Labour Party, suffering that awful election defeat. Jewish people who've voted Labour their whole lives not being able to ever vote Labour or even consider voting Labour was horrifying, having doors slammed in, I'm sure, all of our faces when we completely empathise for the reasons why people never could even vote Labour. Having that dilemma ourselves, I'm sure, definitely can speak for myself, how and where to vote, being kind of forced to choose between your politics and your identity is never a place where anyone should have to be in, let alone kind of minority communities or us as the Jewish community with a party which I believe is kind of our seemingly unnatural political home. But that was kind of the position that we were in, and I think that, to coin a phrase, hopefully things can only get better, but I think that the election is going to be a really key time. The Jewish Labour Movement currently are live streaming their deputy leader hustings, and on Thursday will be their leadership hustings, where kind of all the candidates are coming together discussing issues ranging from anti-Semitism. Well, I was just tuning in actually, and the first question was on council budget. So not not everything that we are interested in always pertains to anti-Semitism, but obviously a key thing that whoever gets elected will have to tackle with, and especially with the Equality and Human Rights Commission report going to be published, that would be one of the first things that the leaders need to take on. And we need to be vigilant as a community and as a Jewish Labour Movement National Executive and as kind of communal organisations to be sure that we're holding these leadership, the people who are in our leadership to account, making sure they are, they, like you said, they've signed up to the pledges, that's fantastic, but are they going to act on them? Is it easy to do this in an election period? Everyone promises the world in an election period. I've definitely been guilty of that myself. But I think that it's about that true accountability, and it's exhausting. No one's saying that it won't be exhausting. The community has been through so much, and it won't be kind of a magic wand, but hopefully I absolutely hope and pray that we're seeing that we're starting in the right direction, and there is kind of a bright future, hopefully for Jewish people in the Labour Party and for the Jewish community kind of at whole. And I think what was clear for me from the victory from the Conservatives is that the country isn't an anti-Semitic country. The Conservatives have their own problems. That is, I believe that is very clear, both with anti-Semitism and definitely with other forms of racism. But I think that what I took from it is that the country kind of rejected the hard left. It rejected the notion of Corbynism, and it rejected all of his all of the people that stood by him. And I am really disappointed with the election result, but I think that kind of to know that the country was kind of stood with us and hopefully rejects kind of this notion, that is some small win to take from it. But I think that racism and anti-Semitism pervades all of our political discourse, and it's fully our responsibility, alongside other kind of communities, to be tackling it head on. Where anti-Semitism raises its ugly head, other oppressions do so too, and I think that kind of together, hopefully, we can defeat this bigotry. Thank you.
Izzy just referred to the conspiracy theories that still exist in the Labour Party. Two interesting articles in the online edition of the Jewish Chronicle today. One of them is from the Tribune magazine. Jeremy Corbyn's advisor, Andrew Murray, has appeared to suggest the chief rabbis intervened in the general election because he was being used by the bourgeoisie to defeat Labour. So the bourgeoisie may be haunted by this spectre a little longer. Certainly, through all its considerable resources, from the mass media to nominally retired security officials to religious leaders, into securing the defeat of the Corbyn project, which, since the 2017 election, has posed a realistic threat to their power and at least some of their property. That's a report in today's Jewish Chronicle. And the other one looks at what Momentum members believe about anti-Semitism, and the figure of 92% among Momentum members thought that anti-Semitism was a real issue in the party, compared to 73% of those who weren't Momentum. Now, Joshua, you were a member of Momentum, so what do you make of that? Maybe you can mention that when you're talking.
What do I make of it? I always preempt any conversation about Momentum with the idea that to understand the organisation, you have to understand that it's already a coalition of numerous left-wing factions that once were outside the Labour Party and some of them that were inside. And there's a group of people who are involved in Momentum, I would admit still, who are of that traditional left faction within the party, and at the moment, quite entertainingly, are internally fighting those that originated from the SWP and the Respect Party and that still find themselves in Momentum. And one thing that Corbyn was able to succeed in doing was uniting those factions and saying that whatever shade of left that you are, as long as you're left of, Ed Miliband perhaps, and you can go all the way to George Galloway, I can be your saviour. And that's something that I always take into account when it comes to conversations about Momentum, because I think that if the next Labour leader is someone that deals with anti-Semitism appropriately, we're going to find that a quarter, maybe a third of existing Momentum members continue their involvement in the party, no problem. But the others, I would imagine, either find themselves shown the door or naturally feel as though this is no longer the party that they will identify with, because they were never people who truly identified with Labour values. They found themselves in George Galloway's party in the noughties, and they would have found themselves in the Socialist Workers' Party and Militant in the 80s. So that statistic is probably quite accurate, which is a terrifying thing. In terms of myself, I grew up in the Labour Party. It was as much as a home to me as the synagogue feels like a home naturally as a Jewish person. Because for me, a constituency Labour Party meeting was like a creche. My mum was involved, she would take me, I would try and vote at 3 years old, draw in a colouring book in the corner. Like it was honestly where I spent the majority of my time as a child. So it was just natural that I would grow up and join as soon as I could, and I did. I joined in 2009. So this will be my 4th Labour leadership election where I can vote. And it's the very, very first, personally, Labour leadership election where my priorities are not what are the politics of the leader and where do they stand on nationalisation and where do they stand on public sector funding, how much will they commit to improving the NHS, etc. My priority is, will they fix the party? Because it genuinely feels like the Labour Party that I grew up in is no more and is completely shattered. And that is really, really heartbreaking. When it comes to the hard left, I think there are 2 ways you can find yourselves within it. You've either always organised within it and it's your natural home. Like I said, you're somebody who would have organised within Respect or SWP, Militant if you were around in the 80s, or it's something that you naively fell into, which for my case, that was it. I naively fell into it. When I voted in 2015 for who would succeed Ed Miliband, I wasn't that involved in the party. I wasn't even living in the country. I'm one of those non-doms. I was out in Spain. We were members of the European Union. I was teaching English. I was having a great time. And I was still a member, so I had a vote. I was part of CLP International, as they call it. And I remember wanting to look at policies, everything that I wish I could look at today in our contest. I wanted to look at who would truly commit to ending austerity, who was going to bring back the conversation regarding nationalisation of major industries, things that I'd grown up thinking were bastions of Labour values. I had no ill will towards the new Labour era, apart from the fact that obviously the big era, which was the war. And I remember being an 8, 9-year-old child and going on those marches with my mum. And she was a Labour councillor at the time. And there were many, many things that we supported in that government, and that was one that we didn't. And that, I wouldn't say, was a hangover that I felt in 2015. But when you're faced with a choice and that becomes an issue that is thought about, it was something that fed into my decision, the idea that we've got a candidate here who wasn't in favour of the war and who's been anti-war. And if you're 20 years old, that's an attractive idea. And I think if we're to understand the success of Corbyn and Corbynism, we have to understand why there was such a youth vote for him in 15 and 16. It was because he was saying things that people my age then were listening to and we wanted to hear. So when I came back to the UK following the European referendum, looking to start afresh back in the UK, it was again, where are you going to organise? Suddenly there's this internal war. And I didn't feel like it should be a war. I felt like everyone's Labour. We have slightly different opinions on this, that, and the other. But there's this ongoing battle, and it was a battleground that I hadn't been involved in for a year. So I had, at the time, no personal understanding of Corbyn's, quite frankly, abhorrently problematic history. I had no idea. And I think that's a position that the vast majority of people in their late teens and early 20s who supported him would have found themselves in. The question is, how long do you stay in that bubble? Do you stay there long enough where you start to believe that anyone that disagrees with you and disputes the ideology of Corbyn and claims that actually perhaps this isn't a man of complete peace and unity, are you in that bubble so hard that you deny them the right to speak? that you completely dismiss them, that you accuse them of smearing your leader, that you accuse them of being part of a conspiracy, perhaps? Or are you someone that listens and thinks, okay, well, people are going to have a reason to say this, we should look into it? Sadly, I got a rude awakening in 2018, and I had only been actually, I would say, involved in Momentum for six or 7 months. And it was very much a hyper-localized issue about our council and our mayor, and the people whom I had attended meetings with, signed letters with, gone canvassing with, door knocking with, after the mural that came out, the one that was in Tower Hamlets and that had, a lot of you are nodding, that I think was a tipping point for a lot of people. That blatantly anti-Semitic mural came out, and I found that these people were immediately willing to defend it and claim that the mural was actually a great work of art. And we're taking a look at you and your colleagues, on the front line in Parliament Square protesting anti-Semitism, and in fact were sending their colleagues to protest the protest. And that, for me at the time, was the most disgusting thing I had seen. Somebody whom I'd been to meetings with, I'd shook hands with, I'd had a drink with, was at that demonstration protesting people who simply didn't want anti-Semitism to become rife in the UK. And that for me was an immediate tipping point, and I was like, these people do not share my values. There's absolutely no way they do. It's not an issue of mild education, because you don't do these things if you're willing to listen and you're willing to have a conversation. So I'm now 2 years into my enlightenment, and I think what you've both said is so correct. I don't think any of us got into politics, or involved in politics, because we're Jewish. We're just Jews. That's just something we are. And actually, we're really interested in public sector funding and the NHS and schools and good quality housing. But yet, for 2 years, I found myself having to become an expert on the Middle East, because I'm constantly having to defend Israel's right to exist, which I never thought I'd have to really spend much time doing. I've had to become an expert on contemporary and conspiratorial anti-Semitism, because again, that's something that I'd bet money on the fact that everyone in this room grew up with the understanding of what anti-Semitism was, without very much having needed to have a conversation that was very explicit with an elder about what it is. It was just something that we soaked up. We knew what it was because we heard it all the time. We knew what the red flags were, what to look out for. And that's something that I've had to learn, that other people in this country, whether they're politically active or not, do not have that understanding of anti-Semitism, don't have the same immediate red flags, and want to, for good or ill reason, to explain things away and say, so-and-so didn't really mean that, their tongue slipped, they forgot, it's not my view. Whatever it is that they're saying, they want to make an excuse for it, and that isn't always from a terrible place, but it has led us to a terrible place. And this is the first Labour leadership election out of 4 that when I vote, and I'll be voting at the very last minute because I'm waiting until everything comes out and everything is said and every member and faction is pandered to by the end of it, I will be putting unashamedly the Jewish community, my community, as the priority for whom I vote for, because the anti-Semitism that has been mainstreamed by the modern Labour Party and that has been, I think, welcomed by Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him needs to be cleared up. And that is a fundamental priority.
Can I ask you how much you think it's possible to reverse these trends, given that Rebecca Long-Bailey and some of her friends got some very young supporters elected, and the nature of the MPs in the who in Parliament now has changed from the previous Parliament?
There's a number of MPs in the Parliamentary Labour Party since 2019 that are problematic, that I think should not have been candidates, and they definitely would never have been accepted as candidates in 2015 or 2010. That wouldn't have been the case back then. but they don't outnumber the rest. We lost an awful lot of really good MPs in December. We lost the JLM's parliamentary chair at the time, Ruth Smeeth. You know, obviously we lost candidates who had stood down and had left the party, like Louise Ellman and Luciana Berger. But because of that disastrous result, we also didn't elect all of the problematic candidates who stood in that election. So we're not in a situation where the PLP has been overrun or taken over. And we also elected some pretty brilliant people. We've got, especially in London, people who have been staunch allies of the Jewish Labour movement, of the Jewish community. You know, people like Florence Eshalomi in Vauxhall, Abner Pomasari in Erith and Thamesmead. There are a number of others. Right now, I can't remember them, of course. So I'm not concerned that the party is at point of no return. However, were a particular candidate to win the leadership, I'd ask myself that question for the final time as to whether there is forward that we can go. I think the majority of the candidates in the race for both leader and deputy are people that we can work with. And frankly, we do have 5 years. We do have 5 years to rebuild. There won't be a general election for at least 4.5 years. And I think at least 3 of them will be spent clearing this up.
Would one of you like to comment on the need for changes in the organisational structure of the party? Voting systems were changed in the last few years. Is there a way back to the status quo ante?
Have a go at it. I think on anti-Semitism, I would say about 60% of the work can be done in the first week by a new leader if they're determined. And that's a lot about the messaging, the clarity, the not equivocating, the not saying, well, you know, maybe it's not. If there's someone who comes out the blocks and is absolutely clear that this is something they're going to sort out, I think, I can't remember if it was Izzy or Josh who said it, but I think you're absolutely right. There'll be, I think it was Josh, who said there'll be a number of people who resign from Labour who are anti-Semites. Yeah. I think you're going to see that happen. I mean, even after the, the candidates signed up to the 10 pledges, you had people saying the effective things on social media like, where can an honest anti-Semite be a member of a political party now? If everyone's against anti-Semitism, what space is there for me? And I think that made me very happy whenever I saw that. And so there's that. But then there's 10%, so 60% done in the first week. 10% will take more than 10 years because the Jewish community is not going to forgive for quite a long time what's happened. But about 30% is going to be getting into the weeds, sorting out problems among some of the MPs, but also in the National Executive Committee and Labour Party HQ, in the membership, in the local meetings that I was experiencing. That is going to take some time to kind of eke out all the problems. And so I think it will take determination. I think the Jewish community and our allies in other places are going to have to be on the case of whoever wins, even if they've got goodwill, because there will always be the temptation to, because the Corbyn movement will still be strong within Labour, even if it doesn't win the next election. There'll always be the temptation to kind of pacify them. So we've got to keep an eye on keeping the party moving in the right direction and not letting up and using a few years at least to make Labour rebuild from the ashes.
I think kind of on that, I think one of the key things that kind of springs to mind isn't necessarily around the voting systems within the party, but it's around the complaint system that's been kind of one of the key proponents of what's failed Jewish members in the Jewish community. Up until now, we've seen kind of, and it was definitely brought out in the documentary, kind of the meddling in the complaints system, kind of different sanctions being placed on different people, seemingly based on kind of where their politics might lie or who they might have supported in certain elections and stuff like that, and kind of different punishments for being an anti-Semite or for voting for a different party. And I think that a truly independent complaints procedure, not just for anti-Semitism, but for things like sexual harassment as well, and other issues that have pervaded the Labour Party over the past few years and however long, really, is going to be one of the key biggest things that I think we will be as a Jewish community and as a Jewish Labour movement asking for and demanding for, like we have been over the past few years, but is something that I think will really test and show the true determination to be able to truly root out this evil within our party party. And I think that is something kind of that springs to mind the most, is around, are the candidates going to commit, and I think most of them have, but are they actually going to implement a truly independent complaints procedure where people don't feel ashamed to speak up, people don't feel scared to speak up, people don't feel like they'll be reprimanded if they do speak up about their own oppression, which is baffling, and that it will actually be taken seriously and most of all acted upon and sanctioned. And I think that is one of the key things, that when people lose trust in that, where can they feel like they can go? And I guess kind of the answer is from that is to often just leave. And that's definitely what's happened. So I think that for me, it's not necessarily the voting structure, sorry for kind of answering the question I want to do, but definitely around kind of the internal structure about the complaints procedure. I think it's one key thing, but that's notwithstanding kind of the people kind of still in the upper echelons of the party, the people still in the kind of holding the key positions on the executive committees, and the different kind of constitutional committees that handle complaints and things like that. But that's kind of a key thing that I will be eagerly looking out for. And of course the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, will be making their recommendations, and kind of we'll see what comes out of that as to what they say, and what their recommendations are to the party about how they should change and what they must do to rid this out once and for all.
I did just want to add one thing on the independent process. I think obviously this is absolutely essential in Labour's case. We've seen time and time again, completely inexplicable decisions, people being let off. I mean, the clearest one for me is Pete Wilsman at the moment, who spoke about the Jewish community, all Trump supporters. Then apparently he apologised, he underwent training, then he offended twice more and is still only suspended from the Labour Party and is, in theory, liable to move back onto Labour's National Executive Committee as soon as they can let him off through the back door. But what I would say is, on this independent process, I think it's something that all political parties could benefit from, actually. I mean, some of you remember in the Liberal Democrat Party, Jenny Tong and David Ward, and we've got a number of Conservatives, Sally Ann Hart, who was engaging before she was elected in the last election in kind of George Soros-related tropes, anti-Semitic tropes. I think there's a problem with political parties letting off their own mates. And I think that's something that crosses all parties. There's always going to be the temptation to do what's politically expedient. So actually an independent process for all parties would probably be a good destination, although it's obviously Labour's the most in need of that right away.
I think Labour members also need to understand what anti-Semitism is, because it's something, like I said, we get it. We've been told stories by members of our family whom perhaps survived the Shoah, or perhaps grew up in the UK during World War II, that understand the history of the Soviet Union and the state-sponsored anti-Semitism. And, we could have a conversation about what is anti-Semitism for hours, but Labour members aren't going to do that. And most people aren't going to do that. So I think it's really important that when organisations like, the actual representative organisations, the one that represent 80, 90% of the community, whether or not you always agree with them, they're the mass organisations, the BOD, the JLC, JLM, and there are others, the ones that speak for the majority of us, have to be believed. If CST publish a report that proves, or perhaps proves is the wrong word, but illustrates a correlation between the conversation around anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and attacks on the street that are motivated by hatred of Jewish people, that's something that Labour members and Labour officials shouldn't be able to open and go, well, let's pull it apart. Let's debate it. Let's have a broad, wider conversation like we would over a different political issue, say council tax reduction, because it isn't council tax reduction. This is about something for which we've suffered for 4.5 years, and we do not want to go through any more. So if you're still willing to pull it like they tried with the RHRA definition, let's take the bits we like and leave the bits we don't like and rewrite it because we know better. It's ludicrous. And if something's going to change, Labour members need to be told from the top, this is anti-Semitism because the CST and the BOD and JLM and the whole Jewish community in the UK and the world even has told us it is, and that's the end of it. And we're not going to debate it or have a motion or a conference protest. We're going to accept it, and if you engage in those behaviours, you're out. There has to be some sort of zero tolerance and some sort of acceptance of what people in our community say.
I think it's interesting that in the general election, some of the Labour candidates in the red wall areas in the north reported that people on the doorstep were referring to anti-Semitism, even though there were no Jews in their constituencies.
Yeah. It cut through. It did cut through, because
Yes.
even if...
So there's a certain image now that people have, and if Labour wants to get back, they're going to have to change that image.
I think that's right, and I think, you know, I mean, I think it was as you said that this gave you a lot of faith in the country. I think not everyone understands exactly what anti-Semitism is. I think that's clear, that it wasn't always clear to people what it meant, but they realised they didn't like it, whatever it was. And for a lot of people, there was an element of the whole anti-Semitism travesty that fed into other things that they didn't like about Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. One was the sense that this is anti-British. You know, a lot of people, and this is, I think Lisa Nandy mentioned this in her On the Doorstep Wigan, people who'd fought in the Second World War, weren't Jewish themselves, but knew they'd fought Nazism and they'd fought anti-Semitism. And the idea that this was coming into our country was anti-British. And that kind of fed into ideas about this Jeremy Corbyn, he's anti-monarchy, he's anti-army, he seems to be pally with all the enemies of Britain, he stands with Russia when they poison people in Salisbury. All this sort of stuff is the anti-British. And the other side of it was incompetence. Yeah. Because for some people, it was just like, can't he just sort this out? You know, how hard is this? Why is this still in the news, this anti-Semitism? I don't really understand it. But can't this just... And it just came across that this wasn't someone who could solve big problems like some of the funding challenges to the NHS, or who wanted to do these big things like renationalise major industries. If he can't sort out his own HR issues in terms of anti-Semitism, how could he change the country for the better? So I think those two things kind of made the anti-Semitism thing relevant to people who maybe it wasn't immediately an issue for.
Right. I think we'll ask the audience to...
Can I phone a friend?
Please ask us anything, literally anything. Like, be candid.
Good evening. Before we look at the potential rosy future, can we take a step back to the Panorama programme that was shown on BBC last year? It came loud and clear that there was huge interference by the leadership in the investigation of anti-Semitic complaints. As far as I know, the leadership in the forms of Formby, Milne and Murray are still there. Can you tell us, of all the investigations which were underway, and I think there was something like 130 investigations, where are we now, or where is the Labour Party now today with those investigations?
Yeah, where are we now? So, yeah, those people are still in post. And I for one, I maybe, again, I was naive, bloody pattern here, but I actually thought that the defeat in December would mean that, you know, Thursday we lose, Friday Corbyn resigns, and his pals go with him, because, you know, what a defeat that was. That didn't happen. They were all still there, which is... in no other industry, not even in politics, would you lose so badly or do so awfully and just keep your well-paid jobs and carry on. But they are still there, and they're going to be there until we get a new leader. And of course, it does depend on who that new leader is. I'm quite confident that at least 2 of the candidates would get rid of them in the first week. If they can. Well, I think for some of the candidates, it's such a priority that they'll do what it takes to move them, to make them irrelevant, whether it costs a lot of money. I'm not sure how hard it is, but it will be a priority. In terms of the investigations, I actually think that, you know, obviously none of us are in Southside, which is the word we use for HQ, and none of us are in Lotto, which is the word we use for Jeremy's office, the leader of opposition. So we don't know what they've done with them, but we know that the Equality and Human Rights Commission are currently investigating the entire party and they've demanded for them to open the books, and that report will be published this year, I'm told, before the summer. I think that's accurate, it's before the summer. And they will have demands of the party and what they need to do. I actually think a lot of those investigations, in terms of my personal experience, because some of them are complaints that I've made, are in the long grass. Because I went to a meeting on Saturday with people whom I've made complaints about, who have shared anti-Semitic materials, said anti-Semitic things, and a lot of it, you end up in the situation where it's the environment of anti-Semitism, but it wasn't anti-Jewish itself. There's one person who, I stood in the general election, and someone said online, isn't it a shame that we lost the great candidate Chris Williamson, but we've got one of the chief Labour witch hunters standing in Braintree? And they were referring to me because I was standing in Braintree. And that person was at the meeting, because that's totally allowed. So, that I think they're in the long grass, to be honest.
I would say on the numbers point that nobody trusts the numbers that we're getting from Labour Party headquarters. And I think it was Keir Starmer who's said that day one he's going to ask for the cases that Labour HQ think that they've got going, and then he's going to ask the Jewish Labour movement for their list and compare them. And we'll be asking some pretty serious questions about who's on which list and why. And I think I think that there's been little reason to trust what's been going on. Sometimes the numbers that they released didn't even make sense. They were contradictory. I mean, I think some of the people around the leadership would be well advised to resign, frankly, because even if, some of them have been put on long-term contract, but gross misconduct, I mean, if people have been actively involved in anti-Semitism, they may well be fired and without receiving a penny, and certainly gross incompetence for their absolutely disastrous performance in a general election. I mean, where they starved candidates in marginal seats of resources. I don't think they bothered campaigning in Scotland. There was just a lot of very, very obviously bad decisions. And I think that some people would do well to consider their positions before they're pushed. But it'd be quite nice to see them fired, frankly.
How can we take you seriously when you put up a candidate, Rebecca Long-Bailey, who says, and she's quoted as this, that Corbyn wins 10 out of 10. I can't take you guys seriously. I can't vote Labour in 5 years or 10 years if you've continued to keep people like Corbyn in the background and you're putting in Rebecca Long-Bailey, who probably gets into bed with him to discuss the policies. I can't understand. Please explain.
Can we take it in threes, just so we've got a bit more material to work with? Good question, thank you.
Hi. For those of us who have been aware of Jeremy Corbyn's track record over the past 30 years, what has happened in 2016 will come as no surprise. Just because Corbyn has gone now doesn't mean to say that the whole culture of Corbynism hasn't survived and will carry on. Those of us involved in grassroots activities are completely aware that it's not just the hierarchy that are involved, it's a culture which pervades right across the party of this, and which has become encouraged by what has happened to Labour at that loss. It's conspiracy, it's a whole tranche of different things. And is it not, so the question is, in reality, is it not the case that the only way this will be dealt with, because I don't share your optimism, is it not the case that the only way this will actually reverse is for Labour to now split and to leave the rump of the hard left, the momentum, militant tendency, whatever you like to call them, to their own devices, and to reclaim Labour as it should be, as we've all known Labour to be, as a party, as a democratic party, as a party of the people, as a party that we can vote for. But the only way you're going to recover that is to return to centre-left moderate Labour. And are you prepared, if in that eventuality, to actually make that commitment, which you should have done 4 years ago, and split away from this appalling situation that you find yourselves in? And will the EHRC help you along to make that decision.
Thank you.
Do you think that this anti-Semitism that has come to a head only recently in the last few years has actually been in the Labour Party for years and years and years, was just being kept under the surface and only came to a head when Corbyn became its leader? And of course, the obvious question is Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semitic?
Okay, so first of all, a common theme of scepticism, which I think, I mean, I speak for myself, I share some of, and I think we'll just have to judge people on their actions. I don't think we can judge people on their words. We've had too many good words. I think the thing that gives me some degree of optimism is the strength of what I'm hearing from leadership candidates, and also just seeing how brittle the coalition, Josh spoke about this, that there are certain aspects of it who just cannot tolerate the idea that they don't want to be in a party where anti-Semitism isn't allowed. And that in a weird kind of awful way, that kind of gives one hope, because I think some of these people are going to clear themselves out or potentially be cleared out. But I don't think we can take any of it for granted. And I think I'd urge you to retain your scepticism until the Labour Party does enough to win back your trust. I think it's impossible to say what's in someone's heart, as the question about Jeremy Corbyn himself. But, one looks at the company he's kept, one looks at some of the things he's said, and one looks at the fact that he consistently failed to take action on anti-Semitism. He certainly failed as an anti-racist. Let's start with that. And, I think his record will be one of absolute shame. And he'll go down in history as probably the worst leader of the Labour Party ever, but certainly someone who has allowed anti-Semitism to thrive. Whatever his personal views, it's hard to say, but he's certainly been a part of the problem and could never have been part of the solution. That's obvious.
I echo everything Phil said. I think in terms of Rebecca Long-Bailey, I agree. It was, I agreed that I disagreed with this 10 out of 10 comment, obviously. It's unacceptable from my eyes. I think that Josh touched on it as well. If she was to win, I certainly will not be voting for her. And if she was to win, I would kind of ask myself that question probably one last time. Is this still kind of, do I think this party can be redeemed? Do I think and do I think I can be part of that? And do I think I kind of have, the emotional resilience anymore to be part of that? And so I will be asking myself that question, where I don't think I necessarily would be doing as immediately with other candidates. So that definitely is playing on my mind quite a lot, and is something that does quite deeply trouble me. In terms of kind of the culture of Corbynism, I think that, or the culture of anti-Semitism under Corbynism, I think it's clear that anti-Semitism has become institutionalised. It's not just the leadership, it's not just the company that Corbyn surrounds himself with, it's not just laying a wreath, it's not just commenting on a mural, it's this acceptance, and we've all touched on it, I think. It's kind of the undercurrent of things being permissible, kind of the small tropes, the small microaggressions that people face every day within the Labour Party that has become permissible. And that really is the problem. And it's true, that's not going to be solved overnight at all. And I think it'd be wrong for any of us to have that expectation when we're voting, or for anyone really, the community and the wider public. I think it's clear that the party's failed the Jewish community. But where my hope still does come from is that these things take leadership, and the fact that it has got to this point, I think, it's got to a point where it is so institutionalized, and it's so kind of part of the fabric now of meetings and online discourse and things like that. And it's something actually, as a Jewish member, I now come to expect in a meeting, which is baffling. But the real way to root it out is by leadership. And I think that's what we haven't seen. And if we do have a leader that is committed to tackling it, then that's where my hope does come from. That doesn't mean that I'm going to ignore it all, or not, hold it to account, or be worried to go to my meetings every day. But I think that the leadership is so key. Having said that, I wouldn't split. I wouldn't join another party. That's not where my politics are. That's not my political home. I think we've seen over the past few years, definitely, but over the course of history, that splitting doesn't work. Unfortunately, I don't think that kind of what we saw with Change UK, for example, it kind of unfortunately didn't get anywhere. That the narrative that they wanted to use and cut through within politics, and not just in relation to anti-Semitism, but in relation to politics in general and how people conduct themselves, didn't really work. And I think that I'm a big believer of being at that table and fixing it. I want to be a member of the Labour Party. I joined the Labour Party. I believe in the Labour Party's values, of what we discussed earlier. And I'm kind of, I guess, a bit too stubborn to leave. That's what they want at the end of the day. Those people in my meetings don't want me there. They don't want Jewish voices a lot of the time. And actually, I'm not going to let them win. I think it is where I'm at, and it's something I've agonised over so many times at all kind of the big milestones that was the Panorama documentary outlined, kind of the history over the past 4.5 years in detail and kind of and more. Every one of those points has been an antagonising decision for Jewish Labour members, but I think when push comes to shove, Labour is a broad church politically, and that's great, and it should be. And that's how we kind of get the best ideas and get into government and create transformational governments for the people, for the country and the people that need us most. But I think that I don't want to be pushed out. I won't be pushed out, and I'll use my voice and any positions and any influence that I might ever be able to have to make sure that kind of this is rooted out. Leaving the Labour Party or splitting or creating a new party allows the official opposition to be run by, one less Jewish person standing up for it, and kind of could then lead to more anti-Semitism. And so that's what I believe, but it's not easy. That's not a decision that's come too lightly or kind of something that I just kind of made once and I'm fine with it. And I think that with the question of has it come to a head now, I think that anti-Semitism has kind of always pervaded political discourse on the right and the left, and kind of has been a part of the kind of the hard left conspiratorial anti-Semitism, definitely has been at play for many, many years. But I think that I touched on it. It's the leadership, and what we've seen now wouldn't have been permissible. The kind of institutionalized nature of it, which I think is where the key difference is between what it has been and what it is now, is the institutionalized nature, which is what the EHRC is investigating, is where this key difference is, and is why it is come to such a head now, and I guess is why we're here today. And in terms of is Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semitic, I completely echo what Phil said. I think none of us at the end of the day will know what's in his heart of hearts, but like Phil said, the company he spends his time with would paint a picture, and I think at the end of the day actions speak significantly louder than words, and if you're not acting on things, and if you're actually not acting on things, but if you are doing things that are perceived to be anti-Semitic, then I guess actions speak louder than words, and that's what it is. I think he calls himself an anti-racist. He must be the most unlucky anti-racist in history, is what I think, to have kind of constantly been up against all these kind of claims and accusations. But I will never be shy of standing up to what he's done and his record and who he's spent time with, who he has spent time with, who he continues to, and kind of the people around him and all of them. So, like I said, we'll never know, but actions speak vastly louder than words.
Yeah. I wasn't aware that I sounded optimistic, so I apologise, because that's drastically out of character. I'm not optimistic. The people whom I see are still active in the party locally, I'm from Newham in East London. I'm pretty sure I travelled the furthest here tonight, just FYI. Lovely Edgware. The people that I see who have the loudest voice or shout the loudest and are permitted to shout the loudest by those who are not anti-Semites, but are in positions of power and authority and feel like this is something that we can ignore or sweep under the rug, when no, there are people in your party locally who are shouting the loudest in your name, and they are anti-Semites, or they're saying anti-Semitic stuff or sharing that conspiratorial stuff online, and you've got very little to say. So you're complicit because silence is compliance. So I'm not optimistic, but like Izzy, I'm not going to give up. The meeting that I was at on Saturday I made the mistake of live tweeting what was going on, because we're quite sad like that. We want to go to meetings and let everyone else know how exciting the meeting is and what's being said and how many speakers we've had for Rebecca and for Kira and whatever. And it was, I didn't realise, but it was like giving them a gift, because someone stood up who was a big fan of that anti-Semitic mural and said, "Chair, point of order, someone in the room is tweeting and they shouldn't be." And the chair went, "Oh, who's that?" And she went, "It's Councillor Joshua Garfield." And the chair, whom was also a big fan of that "why have we lost Chris Williamson but kept the witch hunter" comment, said, "We can't have that, let's expel him from the meeting." And there was a round of applause. And to expel somebody from a Labour Party meeting, you have to get a 2/3 majority and have a vote. I wasn't staying for that vote. I wasn't going to be humiliated like that, so I did leave. But the jubilation and joy with which they received the ability to keep me out of a meeting, I'm not going to give that to them easily. Right? It's going to take a lot more to get me out of the party that I've spent my entire life in, that my mum has spent the most of her life in. Not going to give them that easily. But no, I'm not optimistic. It's a massive hill to climb. And like Izzy, if we end up with a continuity candidate, I will be thinking, have we done all we can do and have we lost? Right? But I'm not quite there yet. Maybe, like Izzy, I'm stubborn, but I'm not optimistic. It has always existed. There are lots of great, literature on why anti-Semitism is prevalent on the left. In fact, JLM recently gifted a copy of Dave, what's his name? Dave Rich. Is that the one? Yeah? It's terrible. No, it wasn't David Collier. It's Steve Cohen. Steve Cohen. I'm a terrible advert. Let's start that again for the camera. JLM just gifted a copy of Steve Cohen's, left-wing anti-Semitism book for Hanukkah, and every single one of JLM's members got that for free and got to read that. And it's quite a good rundown of why it's so prevalent on the left and what's been borrowed from Soviet Union conspiracies and what originates from a disdain for capitalism, to the point where you look at the conspiracy theory side of capitalism, which is when it veers into anti-Semitism. There's endless explanations. I remember in 2005 when Una King lost her seat, which was a neighbouring constituency to mine. And I remember hearing stories from my mum about some of the things that people in our party were saying about her and the fact she'd lost to George Galloway. People in our party who at the time, in 2005, were on the very fringes, barely came to meetings because they thought, what's the point, Blair's in charge, whatever. But they took pleasure in Una King losing her seat. I went to volunteer in her campaign when she took on Ken Livingstone in 2011 for the nomination to be Labour's candidate for mayor. And again, that same anti-Semitism existed against her. And if you ever ask her about it, I know she's busy in Silicon Valley right now, but she will talk about it having always been there. What Corbyn has done is unite those different pockets of fringes, the people that would have been in the Respect Party, that would have led the Respect Party barely a few years ago, and now are fully fledged members, recently standing to be our candidate for West Midlands mayor, stuff like that. They've been welcomed with open arms, and yeah, he's mainstreamed it. So the anti-Semitism isn't new, but the fact that it's tolerated, it's mainstreamed, that is something that the current leadership is responsible for, in my view, and has allowed to happen. Do I think that he's personally anti-Semitic? Again, I don't know him. I hope I never meet him again, quite frankly. I know where his office in Parliament is, and I try and avoid it whenever I'm there, if I'm meeting somebody or doing some work or anything. But there are pieces of footage where he's been interviewed or he's caught saying something or he's asked, do you understand why this is anti-Semitic? And he doesn't. Or do you understand why Ken Livingstone, why George Galloway shouldn't be in the party? And he refuses to elaborate on that and says, party process, blames it on something else. And you do start to wonder. What I know for a fact is that he doesn't know what anti-Semitism is. He doesn't know. He doesn't understand the conspiratorial nature. He doesn't understand what's connected to the left-wing element, from the Soviet Union. That he's got no time for. What I think is his understanding of racism is what children understand to be racism, i.e. not liking someone simply because of the colour of their skin or who they are, and that's where it ends. And he doesn't bother to take into context society and how institutions operate and how anti-Semitism has manifested for thousands of years and where it has found itself and what movements it has birthed and what other values have become rooted from it. He's never bothered, I think, to take a look into that. So, most unlucky anti-racist in history is an apt phrase.
Izzy, you mentioned that splits don't work, but do you think probably last year when Luciana Berger had left and Change UK had been formed, if Tom Watson and some of his colleagues, and it's rumoured that there might have been 50 to 100 of them, had joined them, then we could have seen a totally different type of party and a different approach to anti-Semitism?
I guess I don't know. I guess no one does. I think in terms of Luciana, what happened to her was obviously one of the most heartbreaking things, I think, and actually probably the most heartbreaking thing and awful thing to have happened in the whole, history of the Labour Party. The fact that kind of a proud Jewish woman, a fantastic MP nationally and locally, but also an inspiration, I'm sure, to myself, but to the panel and to everyone in this room, got put into a position where she was forced to leave the party, where she was hounded out by the sheer racism that she faced and by the sheer kind of negligence towards that racism by the leadership and by the party, is such a shameful place and like I said, was the most shameful day in Labour's history. And I think that the decision she took was brave, and I don't think just because I don't believe in splits and different parties and kind of different directions in terms of politics, centre-left, hard-left, etc., I think that cannot negate or undermine what she did, the decisions she came to, and of course to Louise Ellman as well. Two inspirational Jewish women who I look up to every single day. And I think that kind of what happened to them was abhorrent, and it's a shame, and it's actually one of the greatest travesties that she's not still an MP for the constituents that she represented and for the Jewish community and the country as a whole. But I think that in terms of the kind of the political aspect of splits, I don't think it's necessarily seen or proven to have worked in the past. And I hope and I pray that the Labour Party one day is a place that welcomes back Luciana. If I was elected leader, if I was in the leadership contest, that would be the first thing I did.
Izzy, stand.
And like to make sure that the party is a place where people like her feel comfortable to be able to join again, and that is the true test, and that's the test of the future of the Labour Party. And if people like her, and if people in the Jewish Labour movement don't feel that they can ever be members and feel safe in the party ever again, then I don't see a bright future for the party.
Absolutely. But we do have to accept that with first past the post and with our parliamentary system, splits, they do not work. They do not work. You lose your power if you leave the table. You lose any influence you ever had.
Right, we'll have another round of 3 questions.
I've actually got 2 questions, if you don't mind. Have any of the whistleblowers, as far as you're aware, gone down the route of suing the Labour Party for the negligence that they faced, for not being looked after, for the mental health issues that resulted in the behaviour around the complaints unit? I'm really curious. I think there was talk of it. I wondered if anybody had. And the second question is, we've got a lot of people in this room. We're not all political. What can we do to call out anti-Semitism? Really be interested to hear some of your tips on what we could all do to help, because we're a lot of people, you're a limited number of people. What can we do to help the cause?
Thank you. My question is it not the case that these rabid anti-Semites in the Labour Party were emboldened and their activities gained a very high level of acceptance following the publication of the Chakrabarti report and the fact that she was so handsomely rewarded for producing what was at best whitewash and at worst a work of fiction?
The older people amongst us will remember the Social Democratic Party. There were 4 people: Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers, and David Owen. 4. And if that couldn't work all those years ago, I mean, I joined it then. I was very sorry that if that didn't work, then there's no way that another split will work. What I'd like to ask, though, is, as far as I'm aware, all 4 of the candidates for leadership are not at all critical of Corbyn. There seems to be a willful refusal to blame Corbyn. They're saying that the catastrophic loss of the Labour Party at the general election was purely and simply down to Brexit, nothing else. And they say that the anti-Semitism was merely used as a smear of Corbyn. As somebody, I voted Labour all my life till about 10 years ago. I can't see myself ever voting Labour again with them, because I just don't. I think the party's been taken over by our left.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Whistleblowers and lawsuits. So when the EHRC publish their report, it will we expect it to at least make demands of the party in saying, this is what you did wrong, this is what was unacceptable, this is where you enabled X, Y, Z, and these are the consequences, and this is how you will act. That will be the legal document from which people who've experienced bullying, intimidation, harassment, anti-Semitism, whatever it is that they've experienced, especially in terms of workplace bullying and harassment, that's a legal document from which they can form the basis for a lawsuit, and it will be a very strong document. It's not really something you can appeal. I imagine that the second it comes out, there'll be scores of people saying that it needs to be appealed, but it's just not going to go anywhere, right? On the back of that, I'm aware that the Labour Party put in a complaint to the BBC and said, you've slandered us, you've smeared us. The BBC went and had a look and said, actually, no, we haven't. It was very accurate, very true. We're happy if you need them for a courtroom to get signed affidavits from the whistleblowers. The Labour Party had a look and went, all right, we'll leave it. And in return, I know that as recently as I checked anyway, that the producer of that documentary is now suing the party for defaming him. So they're, currently in and out of court. I think it's an absolute shambles, the response that the Labour Party and the top team gave to the documentary. I think that, for me, was as many tipping points as there have been. That's the moment that I was guaranteed that these people will never solve it. They would sooner watch the party crumble and die and be bankrupt and have no influence in this country than they would admit that they got things wrong and that they made a mess and that they are responsible for a catastrophe. And I think that's one of the reasons that we lost so terribly in December, because they would rather we lose and they keep control than anything else, because that's how destructive they are. But in terms of the individual whistleblowers, I'm not aware of current legal action, and it will be the EHRC report that hopefully gives them the basis to do that. Because some of the things that, I don't know about Phil and Izzy, but I know for myself, I didn't meet any of the whistleblowers before the documentary was aired. So, my interview with John Ware was about an hour and a half. And at the time, we thought it was maybe just members or just people who had experienced it. And it wasn't until a few weeks before it aired that we knew there'd be whistleblowers. And it wasn't until it aired that we knew who they were going to be. And I just think what they did was incredibly brave, absolutely incredibly brave. And for an institution to respond that way is beyond reproach. It's just shameful.
Yeah, completely echo that. I think, completely echo that the way that the party handled the response to the documentary was shameful, was embarrassing at best, was insulting, also at best. And I think kind of as obviously people that spoke, and it wasn't a decision lightly I took either to speak on Panorama. I was obviously, like I mentioned, I faced quite a fair bit of online abuse, and I knew that was going to definitely come off the back of that. But those experiences and speaking up about it was, I think, incomparable to those who were kind of still working in the Labour Party and still speaking up and from their kind of experiences in the workplace and what they had said. And I think that not only, like I said, was Labour's response to the documentary shameful, but the way that they then treated those people was abhorrent. And for the Labour Party to do that, to be treating its staff and its workers with such contempt, was just, it just showed that the Labour Party is just not in the place that it ever should be, or that it was ever set up or meant to be, or that it's just so far removed from the values that it ever once was the proud party that got elected. And I think that I just echo that it's completely shameful, not only kind of what happened to us and the party's response to it, but to those people who were there, and the bravery that they had to speak up about it was kind of extremely admirable. I think in terms of calling out anti-Semitism, it's difficult. Like no one expects it to be easy. No one, I don't think, has had an easy time of doing it. It's really hard, and not only is it hard to kind of find the courage to do so, kind of to speak publicly about it, but also internally. Like I often find it hard, quite emotionally, to often have to talk about things that I don't want to, or to kind of rehash things that I saw happen that kind of are really personal and do kind of, hurt in a way. And I think that finding communities within the synagogue, within other kind of communal organizations is really key. When I was in student politics, the Union of Jewish Students were particularly supportive to me and really, really helpful. And kind of having that safe community to discuss things, to ask for advice, to speak to other people that might have done similar things was kind of truly invaluable. So finding those pockets of communities within wider communities or kind of within family and friends is really, really important. Within the Labour Party, I would always encourage maybe a bit of a shameless plug, but to join the Jewish Labour movement. You don't have to be a Labour Party member, you don't have to be Jewish. You can kind of sign up as ally members as well. And I think that is a kind of a really strong community that I felt in order to be able to have the courage to speak up about it and to kind of know that where sometimes it might not be listened to, where the Labour Party might actually just ignore and has done on multiple counts, but actually kind of having that community and that people kind of continuously reassuring you that you are doing the right thing, that it might be difficult, but it is for a greater good. It is really, really important. That's probably my key recommendation on that. And I think that, we've talked about the leaderships and the leadership contest at length, but I think that. I was initially a supporter of Jess Phillips. I'm a big fan of hers, and she has been particularly critical and particularly supportive of the community over the past 4.5 years and longer. But I was apprehensive at first over other candidates, not only supporting, saying Jeremy Corbyn was 10 out of 10, etc., but serving in his shadow cabinet, upholding still a senior position in a party that has gone to the point where it is being investigated for being institutionally racist, that I believe is institutionally anti-Semitic. And those are still concerns, despite Jess not being in the race anymore, that I still hold with those 4 candidates. And it's like we've discussed, there's a long road to go. There's a long road of accountability. There's a long road of actually, is the person that's going to take the office going to take this seriously? Are they going to, really take seriously the EHRC recommendations, which they're legally obliged to, of course? But we'll see. I don't think some are worse than others. I don't think all of them have said that it's all been a smear. I think that kind of some have laid out quite thorough and detailed plans that have shown that they have listened to the community and they will listen to the community. But I do echo those apprehensions and definitely were mine when I saw the kind of people who are nominating themselves. Actually, are they going to take this seriously? Not only do people kind of uphold positions in power that led to the worst defeat since 35 for the Labour Party, but also upheld an institutionally anti-Semitic party. But I guess time will tell, accountability will hold, and that's all we can do, and we've got to continue to call it out, continue to be vigilant, and continue to question whether the Labour Party is anti-Semitic and whether it continues to be so. But I do echo those concerns.
I totally agree with the gentleman who criticised the Chakrabarti report. Alongside other colleagues, I actually met Shami Chakrabarti during the process and immediately after the report. I have to say, we were a bit taken in by her. She did seem to be kind of sympathetic, but I think rightly our president, Marie van der Zyl, described it as a whitewash for peerages scandal. And I don't think I'll ever fully understand why she was prepared to sell our community out. She was someone who, whether you liked her or not, her work at Liberty was someone who was very much in the public eye, could have got a peerage if that's what she'd wanted, anything. But to get it in such a transactional way that made it look absolutely like she'd done this, it's just a disgrace. And I hope we've seen the last of her, frankly, when the new shadow cabinet is formed. You asked about how you can help, and I've got a couple of ideas. One is about supporting us, those of us who are fighting on. I think that fight is conditional, but just to give a sense and to echo some of the other things that said, as I mentioned 2 years ago, I said I wouldn't attend any more meetings. Last week I got re-elected as a delegate to my local constituency party, and the far left were really quite concerned about that. They started asking me, "Are you really actually going to come?" Because actually, when you begin to put the challenge to them, they really don't like it. And I think that this is a possible moment where we can turn things. So, I know there'll be skepticism, but give us a bit of support in taking that on. But also help us keep it real. Really, don't help us keep it honest. There's also the challenge of being swept away and not recognising the problems. So do those things. Support us both in keeping it honest and also give us the chance to fight back. I'd also say support the organisations that are out there fighting it. Obviously, I work at the Board of Deputies. Pay your community contribution, please. We need that resource to keep that fight up. Join the Jewish Labour Movement. Support the CST. Anything you can do to support the organisations on the front line of this is a good thing. The other thing I'd say is this, and a lot of people here have said this. The day that their leadership changes, even if it's someone who's absolutely determined and does the right sort of thing, this fight isn't over, because we're going to be getting into the weeds with people who are quite bad. By the way, what's Jeremy Corbyn going to do next? He's not going to go away. His new life, I don't imagine he'll be going quietly. His new life afterwards may well attract a kind of circus show of nasty attitudes. And I think, as many of you have been doing, but please continue, spot these things on social media, report them, make us aware of them in the organisations, keep challenging. Don't let this ever become normal. It's not normal. We can continue to fight it, and actually with your support we will win.
And I guess also don't become complacent. Much like what Phil said, for the past 4 years, there's been this spotlight on the Jewish community that hadn't before existed. Suddenly we were sort of hyper-visible in Britain in the midst of this argument. And I think in an ideal world, all political parties, all mainstream political parties at least, will have a plethora of members and those involved from all different communities. And I think the same goes for the Jewish community. If we were to all en masse leave Labour, we'd no longer have a voice from the party. Same goes for if people who were Jewish members of the Conservative Party left there, they would cease to ever care about Jewish issues or anything like that. So that's quite important. And yeah, as Phil and Izzy said, support people. I also think the candidates who aren't critical of Corbyn, there's two elections. There's the internal Labour leadership election, and then there's a public perception of the Labour leadership election. And the things that we'd love to see as a country after December the 12th, and as politically engaged people, as Jewish people, we're probably not going to see it until after it's over, because you have to preach to the converted. You have to preach to 700,000 people, of whom probably 2/3 are going to vote, and the ones who are definitely going to vote are the ones who've been most engaged for the past few years. And there is very much a message of, unfortunately still, because they're still members and they can still vote, if you're too harsh and too critical, as ludicrous as it sounds, of the programme and the leadership that led us to our worst defeat in 80 years, then you'll lose support. So I think if some of the candidates go out on a limb and say the things that we'd love them to say and are really honest, they would climb down internally in the party polls and have less of a chance of winning. So if anything, being too honest would be detrimental to their chances, even if they think it.
Well, I'm hoping we have a follow-up session on this, a link session. I think it's in June when we have Luke Akehurst, the director of We Believe in Israel. He's not Jewish, but he's a fighter for our cause, speaking on Israel, the Jews, and what's happening in the Labour Party. He was a member of the National Executive at one time. Our next meeting is on Tuesday, the 3rd of March, when we have a session led by Robert Bieber, visiting research fellow in war studies at King's College London, on the Jews who helped cure the Nazis in Northumbria. Fascinating story, 3 Jewish doctors who were sent to rehabilitate the Nazis and change their views. I'd now like to call on Harvey Garfield to propose the vote of thanks.
Harvey Garfield, possibly a distant relative of Joshua, who knows?
Maybe.
Grassroots activist for Israel up to 2016. Well, no, still continuing, but then finding most of my work has been devoted to the Corbyn era. Many grassroots activists have been instrumental in researching, delving into Labour social media groups, and exposing this phenomenon of anti-Semitism. But for the most part, we've remained anonymous, and our heads are down. We do our work with our heads down. That's how we choose to work. I am, quite honestly, in awe of our panel, of our Panorama whistleblowers, who have chosen to put their heads above the parapets, expose themselves to vilification and vitriol in their private lives, but have played a pivotal role with us in bringing, hopefully, an end to this appalling state of affairs. And I hope that's the case. And with that, I would like to propose a vote of thanks to our panel. We should all be very grateful to them and hopefully to see an end of this awful situation.